Okay, there we go. All right, and looks like we're live. Very cool. All right, well, thank you for joining me today. This is Contemporary Applications of Skinner's Analysis of Verbal Behavior. Just a word to Dr. Mila. I decided to actually live stream this. I put a thing on Facebook that I was doing it, and I'm going to live stream it, and if anybody shows up, they show up for it. But I just wanted to kind of keep myself accountable for keeping the pace and getting through it and actually not stopping and restarting 5,000 times to try to get the perfect video. Instead, it's just going to be a natural presentation, at least as best as I can do, in case we do have anybody showing up, and I've got some accountability for that. So let's jump right in. Today we're looking at contemporary applications of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, or VB, and also it's that verbal behavior in the context of relational frame theory. So very exciting, very cool stuff. We're going to get going here right at the start. So first, verbal behavior retrospective. So with an audience of behavior analysts who are familiar with verbal behavior and probably work with people who have verbal behavior challenges every day, let's quickly review what verbal behavior is, because I think sometimes verbal behavior. I think the key component that differentiates Skinner's theory, and it really was at the time that this came out, Skinner published the book Verbal Behavior, back in a lot of other people weren't really using at the time, and that is to look at the speaker as the key behavior. So a lot of other behavior analysts well, not behavior analysts, but a lot of other language and listener, and Skinner says, no, I don't think we need to do that. I think if we look at behavior from the perspective of the speaker, then we can see what's going on with that verbal behavior. And Skinner felt that the best way to do this was to consider that the speaker is engaging in a behavior, speaking, that would be reinforced by the consequence. And now, what's the consequence necessarily going to be? It needs to be a socially mediated consequence. So Skinner's theory is essentially, let's cut everything else out. Let's look at the speaker and the speaker's behavior, and then consider the context for that. What's the consequence? There's a social consequence that has to occur, otherwise it's not communication. You're not having any sort of language or verbal behavior at all. It's not, how do you even say it's verbal? So because another person is involved, that's what makes it verbal. So the speaker engages in a behavior that's had been analyzing up to that point when it came out. So really latch onto that idea, the perspective of speaker. That's what really makes Skinner, that's the core, it's the root of what makes Skinner's verbal behavior different. And of course, Skinner looks at the listener, and I mean, he looks at everything, this book. But at its core, let's look at the speaker. So let's look at a speaker with a verbal operant. What's a verbal operant? We have operant behavior. So the operant, in this case, typically we're looking at, antecedent behavior consequences, your, operant behavior. But in a verbal operant, we're looking at a verbal behavior. So that means, like we mentioned, a behavior that's reinforced by other people. And then an operant is that behavior defined by its antecedent and consequence effects. So a verbal behavior is a behavior that is reinforced by other people. It's evoked by some kind of antecedent, and then it's reinforced by a socially mediated consequence. And so we have that speaker engaging in the verbal behavior in order to have a consequence. Skinner recognized, of course, that the speaker and the listener can be the same person, or he liked to say within the same skin. And I think he wanted to do that because he wanted to differentiate from the idea of mind or some sort of like communication being like a person-to-person, human-to-human thing. He really wanted to just pull that all away and just look at the raw science of it. And when he did, he recognized when the speaker and the listener are the same person, we just call that thinking. And so that's all. It's all accounted for inside his viewpoint. So what are some of those common verbal operants? There's a lot of verbal operants if you really want to go all the way down into it. But the big four are echoics. That's when you're copying what the person, what someone else said. So the antecedent is someone says something. The speaker's behavior is to say the same thing, and then the consequence is reinforcing in some way. Amand is of operant where the environment presents some sort of stimulus that for which access is reinforcing, and then the speaker will say the word that's associated with it in order to access that item as the consequence. I have a water bottle here, so if I had a producer to give me the water, I could say, hand me the water bottle, and then that would be a command in order to get the water. Attacked would be contact with some stimulus in the environment. So attacked is essentially labeling something in the environment. I see the water bottle, and I say water bottle, identifying that it's there, and then some socially mediated reinforcing consequence occurs as a result of that. The final one here on the short list is interverbal, and interverbal is when the antecedent is a verbal behavior from someone else. The behavior itself is a verbal behavior without correspondence to the antecedent, and then it's reinforced by some reinforcing consequence that makes the behavior valuable. All right, so those are the basic verbal operants. When we're analyzing verbal operants, we want to be doing it like Skinner focused on from the perspective of the speaker. So we're considering, as we analyze verbal operants, what's the antecedent and what's the consequence. Okay, when we're looking at something that somebody says, we want to think, okay, well, what came before that? What's evoking this response? And then if that response is occurring, it's probably contacting some kind of reinforcement. So what reinforcement is it contacting? If it stops occurring, probably contacted punishment. What kind of punishment is going to affect that behavior? So we're now, by looking at the speaker, we're now able to focus on antecedents and consequences and then do an analysis of the verbal operants. So then, if that's the case, just like every other behavior, we want to start looking at the function. What's the result of this behavior? What does this behavior do? The verbal behavior produces some effect that's valuable to the speaker. What is that effect? And when we can determine what that effect is, we can find out what's going on with that behavior and then affect it in some significant way. So and that's pretty normal stuff for behavior analysis. But the difference with verbal behavior is that we're not looking for the effect like on the environment broadly. We're specifically looking for the effect on another person's behavior because that's going to be your likely reinforcing consequence. Why is that? Because verbal behavior specifically and definitionally is behavior that produces reinforcing consequences through social mediation. So if it's a verbal behavior, then there must be some socially mediated reinforcing consequence that's maintaining it or punishing it or whatever. But typically we're going to expect that it's maintaining because the behavior is occurring. So we can look to others' behavior to help us narrow down that function in analyzing verbal operants. Okay, if we want to do a more complex analysis, there's a few things to think about. First, no behavior is ever under perfect control of only a single stimuli. All right, multiple variables are always going to combine to produce responding because there's just so much going on. Just take the simple example of flipping a light switch off. Okay, if I'm going to bed and I'm going to flip the light switch off, I'm not doing that for just one reason. I'm going to flip the light switch off because I want to save money on my electric bill. It was pretty high this month. It's turning winter and okay. I also don't want to have the light on while I'm trying to sleep. It's going to be harder to sleep. It won't be as comfortable. I'm also thinking about other people that might be in the house there and don't want the bright lights on while they're trying to sleep. So there's multiple reasons that are going to affect my choice to switch the light off. And so the reinforcing consequences, there's 3 I listed there, and probably more than that if we really stop to go all the way down and analyze every single consequence of flipping the light off. Multiple variables are combining to produce that responding. And so when we analyze a complex verbal behavior, we want to be able to do a complex analysis of that verbal behavior and look at all the different parts that control it. The controlling stimuli for a verbal behavior are very similar to typical operant behavior, and we're able to make that clarity by making the speaker the key the speaker's behavior is the behavior that we're going to analyze. So when we're looking at that speaker's behavior, what's the motivating operations that are affecting it? How valuable is the reinforcing consequence? Are there ablative operations that are reducing the value and maybe suppressing that behavior? Is there evocative operations that are increasing the value of that behavior and looking to have it happen, be more likely to happen? Is there an SD in the environment, discriminative stimulus, that's going to say, hey, if you have this behavior right now, you're going to have a better chance of finding reinforcement. You know, a basic example, if you walk in and you see me and I'm just kind of, you know, staring off in the corner and I don't turn to talk to you or anything, and, you know, I'm just not into it. Well, that's, you know, probably not a good signal that talking to me is going to be reinforcing to you. But if you walk in and I just lean in and I smile and like, oh, it's so good to see you today, that's a signal that you're likely to get reinforcement if you engage in verbal behavior, or the interverbal behavior in this example. So that SD matters when we're doing an analysis of the verbal behavior. All right, and then broadly speaking, what's the verbal antecedent? What's going on in the room? What, you know, maybe it's not a socially mediated thing like in the example of me looking at you. Maybe you see the water bottle there on the table. All right, that's an antecedent to your verbal behavior, and that's a, you know, a verbal antecedent. So what's going on that in the environment that's impacting your behavior before it happens? Okay, that's a thing to analyze. Then consequence, of course, because we can look at the specific behavior of the speaker, we can see what the consequence of that behavior is going to be. So what happened after you engaged in the behavior? After I said, oh, water bottle, what happened after that? So we can analyze that and then determine effects for the behavior. That'll inform our analysis. Now, finally, another thing to look at is the behavior itself. And this gets a little bit towards behavior economics and behavior economic thinking and choice on which behavior we're going to choose to use for that scenario. But what's the response effort of that behavior? Or as Skinner would use in verbal behavior, what's the probability that behavior is going to be emitted? The strength is the term that he used. What's the strength of the behavior itself? So we can do an analysis of the behavior component as well. Why is that behavior being chosen over any other behavior that you might engage in? So complex analysis is very possible. Let's do it. Let's take an example here. We'll do a little analysis on my friend Todd. Now, Todd's not a real person, to be fair. And if he was, if you're out there and you're named Todd, I apologize. But you should stop swearing. Todd frequently swears at other children in the playroom when they come near him during play. So that's a problem, right? Because Todd's going to have some negative repercussions from his peers. His teachers are going to hate that. It's going to cause him some grief, right? So that might be something worth analyzing and intervening on. We do analyze Todd's verbal behavior of swearing at the other children when they come near him during play. And we notice that typically that's resulting in them departing from the area. So since Todd's teacher wants to help Todd change this behavior, it's probably going to be pretty good for him if we do. We can do an analysis of the verbal operant. So what's the analysis? All right, antecedent conditions. Todd's got a toy. He's sitting there in the playroom, and a kid comes up to him. That's the antecedent. What happens before the behavior? His behavior is he swears at him, and then the kid leaves. All right, so then what's the function of that swearing? It looks like it gets a socially mediated response from the other kids. They leave, and he gets to continue with what he's doing, keep his toys, keep playing. All right, so Todd's behavior, just like any nonverbal behavior that he might engage in some problematic thing in order to, maintain play. Well, this one's just a verbal behavior because it's socially mediated, and we can intervene, recognizing Todd as the speaker, and change those environmental variables to help him do a better behavior. So I think a totally appropriate intervention would be training some functional alternative verbal behavior that'll produce the same effect. We can teach Todd to say something like, "Hey, I want to be alone now. Please leave." Something appropriate to communicate that he wants the other kids to step back and not take his toys or mess with them or whatever Todd's really looking to have happen at that moment. So we can analyze Todd's behavior, we can intervene on Todd's behavior, and help Todd have better results and stop swearing, and to have the advantages of still meeting his needs without doing a behavior that'll have negative consequences for him. Okay, so now's where it gets fun. I'm going to take another drink of water because I'm talking a lot, and I'm glad you're here. I do have a concurrent viewer now, so that's fun. Whoever's out there, thanks for watching. Leave a little thing in the chat so I can say hi to you. But we're going to jump ahead to contemporary applications of verbal behavior and relational frame theory. Guys, I'm going to get so excited. I love relational frame theory, and specifically its effects on rule-governed behavior, and we'll get to that in a moment. But let's take a look here at relational frame theory today. Hell, it looks like it's Blaine. Blaine, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I hope you're able to enjoy this stuff for my class here. So what's relational frame theory? All right, relational frame theory is the synthesis of verbal behavior that looks at derived responses learned without direct teaching from Freiling. And okay, so that's great. That's a great definition. But what does this actually mean? So it means that we have verbal behavior. We talked about that, from the speaker and all that. But sometimes we can have behavior that's verbal behavior that a person will use without ever having been taught it. And that seems really weird, right? How can you do a thing that you haven't been taught how to do? And the way that works is the study of RFT. But the way that works is through derived learning. So here's an example. And this is an example with my daughter, Elsie. She's just a little 1-year-old. All right, she's learning how to speak right now. So she has learned the word na-na, and that works to get a bottle for mom. And she learned that because my wife would be like, oh, it's time to eat, num, 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 num. And little Elsie would start imitating that, and na, 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 na. And then pretty soon mom starts giving her, she thought it was super cute. And so she starts saying na, 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 and Elsie saying na, 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 and then getting that bottle. And she learned na, na gets me the bottle. Okay, now Elsie's also learned, and that's related to candy. All right. So as an approximation of candy, she can start to say ka and expect that will work to have mom give her candy without mom ever teaching her to say ka or candy in order to get that food item. Okay, so let's break that down. Sorry, this is what we got for doing it live. All right. Okay, how does it work? So we've got a pairing, A equals B. Na equals bottle. She likes to drink milk, okay? So she's drinking milk out of a bottle. Na equals bottle. All right? So that's the first relationship that she learns. Then she learns that na in the presence of mom yields access to the bottle. So she says na when mom's not there, it's not going to do anything. But when mom is there, mom's giving her the bottle. Okay, that's pretty cool because now she's getting reinforcement through verbal behavior. But then she's learning D equals E, ka equals candy. All right, so then here's where the derived responding happens. If A equals B and A yields B in the presence of C, all right, so if na gets you the bottle when mom's there, then if D equals E, if ka equals candy, in the presence of mom, ka should yield candy. All right, now for Elsie, it would. For other kids, maybe not, because ka has some other meanings if you aren't a little 1-year-old Elsie. But for Elsie, that relationship is actually a true contingency in the environment, and she was able to do that, access candy, without being taught to do it. All right, so that all theoretically sounds great, but is that how it works? And so we talked a little bit here about Skinner trying to keep everything really scientific, but a thing that's happened with the RFT approach is essentially we said we think that it works this way. Let's test it, assuming that it does, and see if the results are the same. Because you can't see the covert behavior, but you can see the overt behavior. And so Skinner's like, yeah, I don't want to mess with that stuff. But Hayes and the RFT guys said, well, let's test it out. And so they tested it out. And yeah, you can actually derive the relations, and it's been demonstrated in research there with Murphy et al. In 2005. So, all right. So verbal behavior, RFT, sometimes you hear about them fighting and having different viewpoints from the different camps. What's the deal? All right. My position, which I think is correct, is that relational frame theory is an extension of verbal behavior. It's going as far as Skinner went, and where Skinner said, you know what, I don't want to theorize and take that, I don't want to step away from imperialism and go into rationalism in order to get some data that might help me. I'm just going to stop here. And RFT seems, at least in my perspective, seems to have decided to take that next step and say, well, what if we do some inference and check it out and then test it scientifically? So where do they connect? RFT and VB both are radical behaviorist approaches. Radical behaviorist, as we know, is the viewpoint that internal behavior and external behavior are both behavior. They're both controlled lawfully. And the only difference between covert and overt behavior is our ability to measure it. I mean, if you think about it, if you could read somebody's mind and observe that internal behavior, it's no longer covert behavior because you can see it and measure it. And if you could see it and measure it, it would still function lawfully and based on rules of, like science on how behavior works. So the only difference here then comes down to the fact that RFT is going to take that leap Skinner suggested was necessary in order to access the measurement of covert behavior. And he talks about that in About Behaviorism with rule governance and everything, is like that if we're going to look at this stuff, we're going to have to use inference because it's not observable. And so whereas Skinner was sort of saying that, saying I don't want to use too much inference here, the RFT guys said, okay, well, we'll use some inference, but then we'll test it and stay scientific and pragmatic and functional and contextual, and they're able to get away with it. Okay, so let's look at RFT with complex behaviors. My favorite complex behavior, guys, I cannot get enough of rule-governed behavior. It is so cool. It's so interesting. Why is it? It's interesting because with rule-governed behavior, you can have somebody who's engaging in a behavior that's under control of a verbal contingency instead of an operant contingency. All right? And so what we're talking about here is somebody who's never had the experience, who has no experience with something, behaving as if they did. Like, how in the world does that happen? All right? It's like you can get experience just from hearing the words. And so how could that even work? And it's just kind of can blow your mind a little bit if you think about it too deeply. So how does this work? Okay, rule-governed behavior is acting on an operant contingency that you receive through words. All right. So in words through stimulus equivalence. So you're actually using stimulus equivalence to contact the experience of the rule without actually directly contacting the experience that is connected to the rule. All right, let me explain this with an example here. So here's an example. Let's say you're surviving in the wilderness, and a friend comes up and says, hey, eating the red berries will make you sick. All right, so the guy's never eaten the red berries before. He doesn't know that, are they going to make you sick? Or are they going to give you superpowers? He doesn't know. But he has the words, eating the red berries will make you sick. So what ends up happening when that statement is heard and accepted is that the word eating is a sound sequence that's contacted, that's paired with a frame for consuming food. The red berries is the same thing. It's a phrase, a word, essentially, that's paired with a frame that includes, those berries. He knows, he's got a connection for the red berries and the berries that this guy's talking about. The words make you are indicating the contingency relationship. So like, if this, then that will occur. All right. So then what will occur? What's the consequence, right? So the behavior of eating what? The red berries will produce this result. What's the consequence? That you get sick. And of course, he's got a frame for these aversive physical sensations that you experience when you're sick, right? You're probably, throwing up, your stomach hurts, whatever other thing you've got going on. Not fun, regardless, something to avoid. And so even though that the fellow in this tale has not eaten the red berries and has not been sick from them. He experiences them because those words are related to other experiences that he has had a history with, because he's had a history with eating. He's had a history with contacting the red berries through seeing them. He understands that consequences are the result of behavior because he has a history with that. So make you works for him. And then sick is an aversive consequence that he also has familiarity with. And so because of that, he's essentially experiencing eating the berries and getting sick from it through the words. He's not experiencing it directly. He doesn't eat the berries and get sick and be like, oh, that was a bad idea. No, he hears the words and uses the experience of contacting the words, which occur through the relational frames, to essentially experience without actually experiencing eating the berries. So even though the contingency is not directly encountered, the listener experiences as if it were, but not always. And I'll come to that later. That's the part that really gets me, and why sometimes we accept a rule and sometimes we don't. I could talk about that forever. So let's keep going. So relational frame theory and rule governance, how does this fit with Skinner? Okay, so relational frame theory, Skinner did recognize some framing. In verbal behavior, he talks about metaphorical frames, and how sometimes there's these sort of ideas where all this stuff kind of gets bunched together, like a person can be a frame of things. He really didn't have things fleshed out, but like the guys in the RFT camp had done, several years later. So, give him a break. But he recognized that maybe there's some sort of framing where you're putting things together into a metaphor, but he didn't go too deep into it in verbal behavior. There's just a little paragraph on it, just a couple sentences. He has a lot of differences. It seems as if Skinner was not broadly fond of equivalence as an explanation for behavior. He seemed to have been more likely to look at the history of having consequences work in the same way and be generalized. I really do get the sense reading Skinner that he's doing everything that he possibly can to reject any sense of self at all. I haven't read everything he's written, so I don't know for sure if he would say that, but that's the sense I get. He really doesn't want to have any place at all, almost to the degree that it's a presupposition, that there's just no allowance for any sense of self or like a person who's, making choices or responding to things, which fits with our understanding of determinism that, he definitely held. So, he seems to reject the idea of equivalence as an explanation for some of this learning. So he would have some odds with the derived learning, and he's kind of a wordy guy, so I'm not going to read that whole paragraph. Now, beyond Skinner, who didn't really write a critique to all of that stuff. All that stuff being relational frame theory. Beyond that, there were several contemporary critiques, and there's even some modern critiques. Initially, the big book that came out is by Hayes and others. Hayes et al. 2001, which is Relational Frame Theory, a post-Skinnerian account. And so saying post-Skinnerian, the words post-Skinnerian themselves seems to be just one of those things that really triggered a lot of people. Sort of like it was your anti-science, your experimental psychology, which I don't think Hayes was looking to do. I think I get the sense that Hayes and the guys back in 2001 were really looking to sort of launch a new direction in the field of behavior analysis, and avoid just having, oh yeah, I guess this is just more of the same. There is a sense in which relational frame theory is just more of the same. It's an extension of verbal behavior. But if you're, thinking practically, trying to convince a bunch of educators or educated, academics to like follow your new direction, well, he set up a bomb with post-Skinnerian account, and it seems to have gone off. Not that it's worked too badly for him, but it did bring some criticism. The 2002 article by Dower, this is not B.F. Skinner's behavior analysis or review of Hayes, and he reviewed acceptance and commitment therapy as well as relational frame theory that supports acceptance and commitment theory. We're focusing on relational frame theory, but generally speaking, there was definitely some kickback against Hayes and those guys pushing the RFT model. And of course, the big challenge does seem to be related back to that willingness to use inference versus just not allowing for that. And I don't think Hayes and those guys are just out there in sort of like, well, I think it works this way, headspace land. They really are. We think it works this way, and we're going to test it. And we can't know, but the test kind of supports it, so it's probably right. And there's lots of studies expanding on that to really lock in the theory. But it is just relational frame theory. It's not like, relational frame law or anything. So we know that, it's an ongoing area of learning. But ongoing, we still have some of this debate going on, even as recently as 2019. Hank Schlinger did a special video segment on the Daily BA podcast with Ryan O'Donnell. If you're familiar with that, Ryan's interviewed him to talk about basically his position, which is essentially that relational frame theory and acceptance commitment therapy are just taking us in the totally wrong direction and pushing us back towards a more pure verbal behavior approach. So that debate is still out there, even though generally a lot of people in the field do seem to be accepting for relational frame theory. Okay, utility. How are we going to use this stuff? All right, we talked about the philosophy, we talked about the theory. Well, how's it practical? Okay, so there's a couple big areas that I think this is really practical for us. First, we're able to provide therapeutic support and an explanation for private events that's scientific and still experimental. All right, behavior analysis is a pragmatic, functionalist, experimental approach to psychology, which makes us different than everyone else, and I would argue gives us several distinct advantages through a lot of the other schools of psychology. For instance, the example here, boredom versus RFT, the Journal of Humanistic Psychology and the humanistic approach, which specifically says we don't want to be experimental at all, right? Like they just want to kind of theory craft, and we think it kind of works this way, and sort of look within instead of doing a bunch of testing. Their view is that, well, boredom and depression really seem similar, so they probably are. So just cure your boredom and you'll cure your depression, right? I mean, that's oversimplifying it, but it's like just full only inference, only rationalism, no empiricism sort of approach. To which, what's the behavior analysis counter to that? I mean, people do get depressed. So with RFT, that opens us up to being able to analyze clinical depression, symptoms, syndromes, and behavior analysis, as we see there in the Cantor article. So with relational frame theory, we now can start looking at internal behavior and help provide supports for internal behavior that's private and covert, and we can otherwise just kind of don't have an answer for. All right. The other thing that I think is really strong for us with RFT is the ability to deal with complex language challenges and things like emotions in a more refined manner. It has felt to me, reading older literature, that the general sense of emotions is sort of like, that's some internal thing, who knows, all we need to do is look at the responding. And I think with RFT we can sort of open the lid on that a little bit better, and especially with the acceptance and commitment therapy, which I'm not directly addressing today, but that they're together. Okay, they're in the same camp. We can start looking at internal behavior like emotions, like anxiety, for instance, deal with depression, deal with those internal behaviors in a manner that's refined and scientific. So we don't have to rely on, anti-experimental approaches like humanistic psychology. We can stay inside the pragmatic functionalist experimental behavior analytic viewpoint, where we have, the principles of science to sort of guide our thinking and keep us grounded, and keep us connected to what's real and true. So it really does give us a lot of utility and opens up our ability to help and provide answers for challenges that individuals face. Okay, directions for future research. I did mention this earlier. I want to do this research on rule acceptance. All right. If you remember, we talked about what is rule-governed behavior earlier, and how it's essentially that you, through verbal sequences that we hear a rule, then it's as if we experience that rule, except not every time. And the citation I have here from Stapleton on choosing not to follow rules for COVID-19. What COVID-19 really was a unique experience for our country, because we have almost everyone in the country is in the same objective setting, right? The risk to everyone is actually essentially equal, more or less. But the behavior varied really, really greatly on a couple key things, and it sort of split right down the middle, with half the country saying things like, I won't follow these COVID procedures. I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm not going to get the shot. I'm not going to do these things. And the other half saying I'm going to wear, 7 masks and get 5 shots. And like really big extremes. So, why was that? Why did some people hear the rule and say, yup, I am going to take care of myself. I'm going to take care of the community. Give me the shot. Give me the thing. I'm doing it. And other people were like, no, never, and screw you. Okay. So why did that happen? So some people hear the rule and accept it, and some people don't. And there's conjecture out there that is related to, how strong your pairing is with the source of the rule, and how accurate the rule is, and there's just a whole list of it here in the Freiling book, which is cited, but really we don't seem to have a really strong pure scientific proof for what controls the acceptance of a rule. And that's really going to be valuable. There's basically, in therapeutic behavior analysis right now, we can't reliably predict acceptance of a rule or control it, frankly. I mean, even describing it's hard sometimes. So it's really a challenge. And if we could help people break false rules and build correct rules, that'll really help with a lot of mental health challenges that people would face. So that's a strong area for future research. I would personally like to do that research, so working on a PhD right now to do that. That'll be fun. All right, here's a bunch of references. I'm going to leave it on the screen for just a second because this is being submitted, and the one person who really cares about it is not going to read it from my screen. So thank you, Dr. Milo. All right, a few questions. Of course, we're simulating this. This is actually live, but we're simulating also if this was in a conference. And here's a few questions I thought might be asked. So first, what do you think is the most important takeaway from verbal behavior? For my money, the most important takeaway from verbal behavior is to take Skinner's approach and focus on the speaker. You can't do good analysis on verbal behavior or really consider verbal behavior in a way that's accurate if you don't I just saw that I'm covering the words. I'm going to move that. You can't do that analysis if you don't have that framework to frame out the speaker first. If you're doing some sort of combined speaker listener back and forth thing, it gets muddy and it's challenging. Skinner talks about it in Verbal Behavior. Go read it. But really, I think the most important thing is to really get your head wrapped around speaker as the behavior in your verbal behavior analysis. Okay. Second question: how does verbal behavior versus RFT affect client outcomes? Okay, so controversially, my thoughts on this one are, for most people, most of the time, it just doesn't. Your practical application in a normal clinical setting, you're not going to run into the level of challenging minutia where a verbal behavior versus RFT approach is really going to make it or break it for a client. If you take the pure VB stuff that's out there, it's going to have its effects. I would say, somebody who's well versed in RFT is also going to have good effects. And a bigger factor, whether for your clients, between are you going to stay pure VB or are you going to accept the RFT stuff, a bigger factor is how knowledgeable you are as a clinician and how well you've done your analysis. I don't think the fight over the two is really going to be worth it. I mean, I prefer to accept the RFT. I think it's a great explanation, fits and makes sense, and it's got evidence to back it up. So I think it's great. I use that to the degree that I'm able. But, being a better clinician is more about other skill areas than just do you do verbal behavior purely or do you accept RFT. So I don't think it's the most significant component for client outcomes. So yeah, I mean, learn about all of it, get good at everything, and that'll help you get better. I don't think picking a camp and standing behind it matters. All right, next question. What can I do to implement an RFT framework in my practice? Okay, well, first thing, understand it, read about it. I strongly recommend and like this blue book. Hopefully you can see it there. Applied Behavior Analysis of Language and Cognition by Freiling. It's Freiling, Rayfelt, Tarbox, and Hayes. This is a great book. It really covers everything. Like, it starts with some pretty basic stuff. Like, if you're a behavior analyst, you'll read like the first 5 chapters and be like, yeah, I know all that stuff already. And then it gets deeper as you go on. It's sequenced really well, and I really like it. I would start with that if you want to learn RFT stuff. And then rule governance and all that. It's in there. It's really cool. Strongly recommend that. Additionally, I would recommend looking at acceptance and commitment therapy. For the sake of this presentation, I focus more on RFT than I did on ACT. But our ACT is really a practical application of RFT to help deal with internal behavior, and I think that's great and really a strong area to develop skills in. So if you want to start implementing RFT, start looking at ACT and seeing how that works. Beyond that, really mastering the content of how the RFT, like relational frames, work and the relationships between the different frames and how their pairing develops them and all that. Analyzing that in order to, be able to have a conceptual understanding and of that, so you can use conceptually systematic application for unique situations that you just see with your clients. That'll be really helpful. But short answer, go read this book and study some acceptance and commitment therapy. Number 4, how would I go about learning more about RFT? Well, I jumped the gun on that. I probably should have paid closer attention to my questions. Once again, I'd take a look at this book. Another one that I haven't got all the way through, but I like, is Advances in Relational Frame Theory. This one's Diamond and Roche. All right. Maybe get that up there to the camera better. Good book as well. It's definitely heavier. It starts assuming you know what a lot of this stuff is already. So if you haven't read the blue one first, read the blue one first, and then go into the Advances in Relational Frame Theory. That's where I'd go to get more info and get deep. I mean, that is where I am actually going to get more info and deeper. I haven't gotten all the way through that yet. There is a lot there. And honestly, I don't know, this might be a little controversial, but I would go back and look at Skinner. Go read Verbal Behavior. All right? I mean, it is a big book, and it's got a lot of microscopic level detail. I mean, if anybody ever wants to know if Skinner was more molar or molecular, go read VB and you won't you won't have any questions anymore. But yeah, I would say those 3 books are really good. Go read Verbal Behavior. That's what this whole thing is about anyways. Then Applied Behavior Analysis of Language and Cognition by Freiling. And then Advances in Relational Frame Theory by Diamond. And you should probably be in a really, really strong place. So, okay, that's the end there. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate having y'all here. I cropped my camera off a little bit, so that'll be fine. But thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Mila, for sitting through my presentation. And you guys all have a wonderful day. We'll see you.